Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Michelle and Carrie. That refrain is a famous one that actually Martin Luther himself came up with. So that's why we include it in today's psalm reading. Many of us have been wondering how we can cope when faced with a world that is as deeply troubling as the world is now. For the past 2.5 years, we've struggled with a pandemic that many of us never thought we would see in our lifetimes. And during the pandemic, it felt like just a huge cloud of negative energy just settled down on top of all of us. If you remember the mood during the early year and a half of the lockdown, you may recall that it was hard to keep track of time. Right? Every day seemed to blur into the next because there was no future to look forward to. We had no idea what was going to happen to next, and it just messed up. And people started referring to days as Blur's Day. What day is it? It's Blur's Day. What was missing was hope and a clear way forward. And of course, for that first year in particular, it was totally unclear how the pandemic was going to end. At that time, we were told by the experts that it could take 4 years for vaccines to be developed, which seemed like an eternity. We were lucky that it took less than that, but in the first year or so of the lockdowns, it wasn't clear at all what would happen next. And that was not good for our mental or spiritual health. An alarming number of people reported suffering from depression and anxiety. Now, we're 1.5 years after the first vaccines were rolled out. We're living the future that we had hoped for, and yet a lot of us don't feel much better. We have medicines that blunt the blow of even the newest of variants. This should be a time when we feel like we've come out of the funk, that the bad times are over. And yet, for many people, even with our restored freedoms, there's still a lot to be worried about. The war in Ukraine, the nuclear reactor, which is being used as a military football, with all the scary possibilities that come with that. Our neighbors to the south are now openly speaking about the possibility of civil war. And underneath all of that, of course, we have the constant rumble of climate change. For many of us, this is all just too much. Our psychological health can't stand this torrent of bad news which washes over us all the time. And there's a reason why we feel this way. For some of us who are on the older end of the spectrum, we remember when the news came just twice a day, right? Morning paper, evening paper. And you could choose whether you watched the 6 o'clock news. The news wasn't something that you lived with every single second, constantly being refreshed on your phone. And of course, to make things even worse, social media figured out that people didn't want to just share pictures of their kids and their cats, but rather that they would keep scrolling if you fed them things which got strong reactions from them, particularly strong negative reactions. And so people got into what is now called doom scrolling. Right? Where you're on your phone and you just go from one scary thing to the next and you feel like you're being overwhelmed. So, what do you do about that? Lots of people in this congregation have told me that they've just stepped back from social media, and other people have said they've just stopped listening to the news altogether. Just for the sake of their mental health. They've just said, nope, that's it. I don't want to hear bad news every day, so I'm not going to watch or hear the news. Our problem, of course, is that the world doesn't simply go away because we decide not to pay attention to it. Those who would strip away our hard-won freedoms and human rights are not going to stop just because the silent majority got bigger. Politicians are being elected without the majority of the population voting for them. In the last provincial election, only 46% of the available electorate showed up to vote. And so the current government was voted by a minority of people in Ontario, not a majority. The feeling of being disconnected from society can yield a sense of alienation rather than liberation. The more governments act in ways which we don't think represent our views, paradoxically, the more people are disengaging from the political system, just making that whole process worse. Democracies need citizens who are paying attention, but how do we do that when paying attention to the news seems so toxic to our mental health? In today's psalm, which Christina read, we hear the words of a person who others think has been abandoned by God. They think that in this person's suffering, they've been forsaken by God. And so the psalmist says that they have been abusing me. They have been treating me cruelty and saying that I'm abandoned by you so they can do whatever they want to me. The singer of the psalm may be suffering from depression or a disease or simply material misfortune. We don't know exactly what the cause of their suffering is that makes other people think they've been abandoned by God. And that's actually one of the advantages of the Psalms. They're often quite vague about the exact cause of suffering, and that's why they've been able to float through time. Because when we hear suffering, there's part of us that always says, yeah, I know from suffering. Bring it on. I know exactly where you're coming from. If the psalm had said, I'm destitute because my herds were killed by disease, we might read it and go, oh, well, that's not my problem. So we disengage. But by being vague about the suffering, it's like, okay, keep talking. The Psalms are a curious collection of hymns and poems. They're right in the middle of the Bible. There's 150 of them. And since they're in the Bible, you might assume that they're all pious addresses to God, believers, acting on their best behavior. But nothing could be further than the truth. The Psalms are full of people who are angry and sad and depressed. All sorts of negative emotions, as well as positive ones, are reflected in the Psalms. Some Psalms are like beautiful poetry, just gorgeous poetry. But others are filled with things which we don't often say out loud. And sometimes the anger is directed right at God. Jesus quotes the first line of one of the Psalms when he's on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? The Psalms play hardball. They're brutally, brutally honest. Historically, there have been two ways to pray. One is you just say exactly what you mean to God. You just have a conversation with God. You share your thoughts, your desires, your burdens. There's a wonderful little book by Anne Lamott called Help, Thanks, Wow. And she talks about how to address God. What are the things which you should probably bring up when you're talking to God? And many of us do this. Polls say that about 55% of people talk to God every day, one way or another. So it's still something which people do. So that's one kind of prayer. But within Christianity, there's this other tradition of prayer, which takes us in a different route. In addition to expressing your personal views and your personal problems to God, this kind of prayer involves reciting out loud the words of others, usually from Scripture. In monasteries and convents all over the world, monks and nuns gather several times a day to sing hymns, but also to recite the Psalms out loud. Many of them have memorized the Psalms, which is impressive because there's 150 of them, and some of them are just monstrously long. From the outside, reciting biblical Psalms may sound like an exercise in mindless religious obedience. Pious, yes, but also kind of robotic. A heavy yoke that many of us are unwilling to bear. But there's a deep psychological wisdom in this practice, which is still relevant now. None of us wrote the Psalms. They were written 2,500 years ago and older. So when we recite a psalm in our own voice, when we hear the psalmist's words coming out of our mouth, we are temporarily entering the mind and heart of another person. We're sharing their pains and joys, which are rarely the same as ours on that particular day. As such, this is an explicit exercise of spiritual compassion. By speaking out loud somebody else's prayer, we're walking a mile in their shoes, sharing their thoughts, and forming a temporary solidarity with them. You know, in the Star Trek series, Spock could do that thing called the mind meld. You know, my thoughts are your thoughts are my thoughts. That's what a psalm is. It's a temporary mind meld with somebody else where you can hear what they were saying to God because you're saying it on their behalf. Imagine that there's a young person in our city right now who is living in a place where gang warfare is common. That person, if they're part of that 55% that prays to God, may say, please, God, help me. Let their guns backfire when they try to shoot at me. Let them not come to my apartment block anymore. Let me be able to walk through the park without worrying that they're going to score points with each other by attacking me and go home with a trophy, maybe taking a finger or sending me to the hospital with a bullet in my butt. My wife works in a hospital. This is how messages get sent in some neighborhoods. If you were to hear that prayer, situation very different from your own, and to say it out loud to God, you would be forming a spiritual, compassionate, sympathetic pact with that person who lives a life so different from your own. That is a deep form of spiritual practice in developing empathy. Now, you may wonder, but wait, if I recite their words, am I not just trading my ego for theirs? You know, most of the time I just speak what I want to God, but in this case I'd be speaking what they want to God. So how is that any better? That could be the case, except for one thing. The Psalms, when we recite the Psalms, are never about personal navel-gazing. Every psalm includes God. Sometimes the writer is in love with God and sings God's praises. Other times they're furious with God and they express their concerns and their frustrations. Other times they're just wondering, where did you go? Why can't I feel your presence? I feel like I'm talking to thin air. But no matter what in the Psalms, God is always there. The reason this is important is that each psalm places us in a cosmic context by including God. This is a statement of divine reality, but also a prescription for mental health. In today's psalm, a person who is scorned by others for his infirmity or illness reaches out to God. The psalmist declares that God has sent many troubles into their life before, but has rescued them over and over again. I'm still standing. Despite being in a troublesome time now, the writer declares that they will list as many of God's blessings and graces as they can count. Here's some of the words they say. My mouth will tell of your righteous acts, of your deeds of salvation all the day, for their number is past my knowledge. With the mighty deeds of the Lord, God, I will come. I will remind them of your righteousness, yours alone. The Psalms never shy away from the difficulties of life or the psychological pain that comes with them. But contained in each psalm is a prescription for healing. Be honest about your pain and then reconnect to the source. Not the source of your pain, but the source of all things. Remember the big picture of what God has done, all the wonders of this universe, and which vastly outnumber the misfortunes which you may be experiencing. Get some perspective, as we would say now. The psychological wisdom in the Psalms is that when we're feeling depressed and lonely, the solution is not more isolation, but more connection. Connection to this rest of this wonderful world through remembering God's presence and manifold wonderful works. Now, if this all seems kind of like abstract spiritual advice that's not really important to your life, think about what you did in the first year of the pandemic. I suspect that in that supposed hour of free time we got outside, right, when things were really bad, many of you went for walks outside. And I know lots of you have told me that your solace during the pandemic was walking in nature. It helped that without all the cars and the buses and the planes overhead, our neighborhoods were quieter. We could hear the birds. We could see the animals. And people took solace in connecting themselves to something bigger than themselves by being present in nature, which has its own bustling life going on all the time. That was individuals now just kind of instinctively seeking out connection as an antidote to isolation. And that is precisely what the Psalms present as a spiritual practice. This approach is worth considering because in our time, so many of us are tempted to withdraw from the world as the news gets scarier and scarier. Faced by a stream of negative news, we may react by avoiding social media or turning off the news on the television set, not looking at the papers, to avoid doom scrolling. This withdrawal from the world may seem like a positive road to mental health, but it can be taken too far. Our society is always encouraging us to just focus on ourselves. You know, we used to go to stores in person. Now we can have anything delivered to our doorstep, right? This system is very good at making money by isolating people. There's always a buck to be made by putting people into smaller and smaller and smaller groups. The more lonely you are, the more hungry you are, and the offer of consumer consolation will always be strongly, strongly felt in the absence of any other kind of consolation. The Psalms present us with a different strategy, something different than retail therapy. Connect. Imagine what it is like for other people who are very different from yourself. Not as an act of social justice piety, but as an act of spiritual and psychological health and well-being. Seek out the perspectives of those who are going through psychological states very different from your own. In this sense, reading novels and poetry and autobiographies can be considered part of your spiritual practice, and you may well be doing it already. That's seeking out of different perspectives. People who are suffering from depression or addiction or live in another part of the world totally different from the life that you're leading. That is actually spiritually wise because you're crossing the drawbridge across the moat of your fortress ego so that you can connect with other people. The reason it works is because that inner voice, when you read a book in particular, you have to conjure that other person in your head because their words become your mental voice. You hear their words in your head as your voice, in your voice. We often read books with narrators who we don't agree with. This is a very healthy spiritual practice, particularly when the authors come from cultures and circumstances very different from our own. The word compassion, right, is made of two words, co and passion. Passion means suffering, literally, but it also refers to anything that you feel deeply. And co, of course, means with, sharing with someone else's passions, compassion. And reading and speaking out their words and hearing their words in your head is a form of cultivating compassion. Books can give us access to another person's reality, but a key part of psychological and spiritual healing is to place all of this into a cosmic context. To know that you and the person whose words you are reading are part of a divine sacred order. That you are both held in the same divine embrace, no matter how different that person is from you. You are both in God's hands. That's not something that novels often do, but it's something the Psalms always do. The Psalms do this for our welfare. It's not like, say this so you can be good with God. No, it's try saying this, it will help you. God will get by just fine if no one reads any Psalms. God's fine. God's going to be just fine. We're not pagans. We don't think that we have to offer sacrifices to God over and over again to keep God happy with us. That's not the way it works. This universe is enormous. If you've seen any of the pictures from the James Webb New Space Telescope, where there's millions and millions of galaxies, not just stars, but galaxies upon galaxies upon galaxies. God's got a really big dominion. God will survive if you never read a psalm to yourself. But the Psalms are presented to us to help us as a way of broadening our compassionate, emotional imagination. They are there for our welfare. Developing empathy is not something that comes instantly. It's not like a pill from the psychiatrist which takes effect within a few weeks. Empathy battles a tidal wave of counter-messaging from the society around us. So it must be cultivated steadily and slowly. Prayer using another's words is a tried and tested method for developing empathy and compassion. And it's never too late to try it. Just crack the Bible open, start with Psalm 1, and just start going. One a day, maybe. And if you don't like the psalm, give it up. Just skip to the next one. It's okay. You can always double back if you get into it. On our YouTube channel, you'll find that we've made video versions of a number of psalms, so you can just watch them with the sound on first, the pretty music and everything, and then turn it off silently and just read along the next time. Or you can crack the Bible open. There's lots of ways of doing this. And it's easy to get the Bible on your phone, by the way. BibleGateway.com will do it. There's all sorts of ways of doing it. At first, it may seem really strange when you read out a psalm. You may feel silly. You go, and also you may go, hey, this isn't about me. If I'm going to pray to God, it should be about me. Yeah, I know. You're going to hear that voice. But that's precisely why you should do it, because it's not actually about you. What the world needs now more than ever is people who can imagine another person's point of view, their pain and suffering. But know that as you speak their words to God, God is listening and will reward you with healing that comes from an expanded sense of belonging. For you are not alone. You live in God's world. Amen.